Time and Sexism. Thinking of time is nearly directly tied to death, aging, and the inevitable end of something. The end of life itself. We don't like to think about time, but it's an essential part of all scientific and sociological disciplines, and we must face our fears to move forward. In this video, I present my argument that crossing the disciplines brings us closer to truth, and it broadens our perspectives, that thinking of time could be thought of as a discipline, and it should be more often used alongside the social sciences, and that sexism is more complicated than anyone has recently thought of, and what we should do about it. Obviously, all of these ideas could have been put forward by someone else, but I haven't seen their work, so let's begin. Electromagnetism. The perfect evidence for my argument that crossing the disciplines is good. I was going to be quoting this guy, but then I found out that it was in the public domain, so I'm just going to be playing a clip. Here you go.
There's not a sharp boundary, and this side you have mathematical physics, and that side, or this side you have physics, and that side you have mathematics. It doesn't work like that. There's a very blurred boundary. You had electricity, and you had some equations governing electricity. And every experiment that you did could be explained by the equations for electricity. You had some equations for magnetism, governing all of the experiments that we'd seen from magnetism. And if you looked at all of the experimental data at that day, and the equations that we had, we could explain all of the experiments that we saw. So there was no need to improve your theory. You did already explain all of the data that you saw. But Maxwell had a hunch. He just felt that in fact there shouldn't be a separate theory of electricity and a separate theory of magnetism. Maxwell thought there should be a unified theory of electromagnetism. So he tried to put the equations of electricity together with the equations of magnetism. And when you try to put these two sets of equations together, they contradict each other. They don't work. So Maxwell took a look at how these equations contradicted each other, and he modified one of those equations, Ampere's law. We'll actually go through his argument in this course. After he had modified Ampere's law, all of a sudden the equations fitted together perfectly. The term that he had to add, the term that changed Ampere's law, was so small, the size of it was so tiny that no experiment would be able to detect it.
And now I would like to share a story about the bones being thrown away at an archaeological investigation about 100 years ago. Because you know what? They didn't know that they were useful, because who would need bones for archaeology? I know, it sounds really insane, but they hadn't crossed enough disciplines yet to realize that bones were actually useful for finding out what happened in the past. I don't understand it either. And that was the story. Those are my two main evidences for why crossing disciplines has proven to be very important. And a more ooey-wooey example has to do with the stoneworks of ancient Egypt. If you ask an archaeologist or a historian to look at the stonework and tell you how it was made, they will give you a very different answer than a professional mason. The archaeologist or historian will follow the line and repeat the current history of ancient Egypt, which means that those works were carved by hand using pounding stones, which is horribly slow, and really shouldn't be able to produce fine straight lines. The mason will tell you that the stones were obviously machined, but they won't be able to explain where the machines came from or where they got off to, just that those machines very likely existed because the evidence of them is in the stonework. This possible evidence could not be discovered without cross-disciplinary research. So now that I've convinced you that crossing disciplines brings us closer to truth, let's move on to thinking about time is part of everything. Now, on a base level, this should be pretty obvious. We all exist in the flow of time, and if we didn't, we wouldn't know, because if time stopped flowing, we'd stop noticing. The funny thing is that as far as we figured out, time doesn't flow at a constant rate. It changes with how fast you're moving in relation to something else. So for example, if you're moving 1,000,000 miles an hour and I'm moving 10 miles an hour, you're going to be aging slower than me. Because of relativism. Because of math. I don't want to look at this. It gives me a headache. Now, time is a fascinating subject. It's integral to everything, and yet it doesn't really seem like there's much to learn about it or much reason to talk about it. I tried researching the study of time, but the closest thing I got to was horology, which is the study of clocks, and chronometry, which is the study of electric clocks. Clocks are not time, they're simply our measure of it, and without them, we would still be existing in time, we just wouldn't know how much had passed. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you can't take a course on age studies, even though there are courses on every other section of society. Race, various religions, gender, sex, the liberal arts, engineering, programming. These are all different types of people, but none of those courses study the effect time has on us. Well, there is a science. It's known as gerontology. Have you ever heard of gerontology? Well, until today, I hadn't either. In fact, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Is it gerontology or gerontology? I don't know. Moving on, I'm going to walk into more dangerous waters and try to explain how sexism isn't two sides. because even though there are men and women, using those definitions do not get us very useful results, because both men and women are divided by age very starkly, whereas men versus women are not divided as starkly. It can be easy to lump the two into two distinct groups, men and women. However, this is entirely the wrong way to think about it, as rather than being useful, it will produce inaccurate information. This is because people age, and a man or woman will be very different, sometimes drastically different, at different points in time. At the earliest ages of development, there's almost no biological difference between the two sexes. This is just true. Like, look at kids. There's very, very little difference. There are people who confuse them between each other constantly. You have to put a signifier to tell people, this is my boy child rather than my girl child when they're too little. You dress them up differently and they change genders. It's like, yes, that's because there was barely any difference. And those differences that do exist are more often produced by environment, social class, culture, eating habits, religion, and predilection. All of these things are going to be more defining than simply male or female, because a poor kid, whether male or female, is going to be vastly different than a rich kid. And the fact that they are rich or poor is going to define their experience far more than simply being a male or a female, especially at a young age. I'm of the opinion that predilection is one of the most defining factors that applies to a person. For instance, an artistic boy and an artistic girl are far more likely to have more in common than a boy and another boy, or a girl and another girl, because you can make a lot more accurate assumptions about an artist than a rich kid. I could make a joke here about how the rich artist kid isn't going to be rich for very long, but I won't. Given the generally shared experience of children, that of being treated as children, even those differences will not be very severe, as they haven't developed a perspective yet. But then pre-puberty and puberty hit, and things change. For one thing, hormones start to flow through the body. For another thing, they start getting treated differently by society, and more importantly, they develop their perspective. This is when things diverge sharply, not just on the gender line, but on everything. Children go from being mostly similar to each other to being mostly different from each other. It's around this time that they realize that sex, race, age, height, and interests matter and can define you, and define how you should interact with others. I'm personally of the opinion that these things just don't matter that much. However, it's a fact that they do matter to a lot of people, and I'm not going to ignore that. Now, if we take this diverging group of young people and try sorting them into two piles, we would find that no matter what axis we use, our data would be so vague that it would be nearly completely meaningless. Now, you can use this data to create stereotypes. However, holding these stereotypes in mind will not create very useful assumptions, because there are so many subsections. These are just too broad. Too broad, you can't cut things in half. You could use height, hair color, social class, or interest instead, and you'd still end up with these messy numbers that don't really give you much, if any, definition to the group that they were supposed to define. This is why I think we need to think about sexism in a different way, because there isn't just one kind of woman or one kind of man. There are many. If you're going to have a prejudice, make sure that prejudice is actually informed by reality, or else it's just completely useless. For example, an old man is starkly different from a young one, and you would probably treat them differently because of that age difference, even though you know next to nothing about them. The same cannot be said for a black man and a white man. Even though there are going to be differences, you don't know that there are, because, theoretically, there don't have to be. So what are these ages? Well, I won't pretend to be an expert, so here's just me spitballing. We'll start with women. There's childhood, which is divided between prepubescent and then pubescent girls, youth, which is teen girls and then young women, and then motherhood, which includes women who are at the motherhood age, even if they're not mothers, and then finally, women who cannot bear children, followed by elders. Now, the difference between an elder and a non-elder is a little bit vague, but once someone hits like 70, you kind of can just start thinking of them as an elder because they've survived all that. And they've gone through enough life experience that I'm sure they have some kind of wisdom, even if they don't think they do. In fact, this is kind of mildly reminiscent of the maiden, the mother, and the crone from that show that nobody watches. There are obviously some people that do not fit well into these categories. For example, people who skip the teen girl stage altogether because of social pressures, or family loss, or all sorts of things. Or people who didn't want to advance from one stage to the next. Even though peak fertility is about 21, female humans can bear children as young as 12, which is post-puberty. And interestingly, the age of puberty for girls has actually shifted, although that's a subject for another video. Anyway, this fertility brings with it the risk of unwanted childbirth, and thus a danger from fertile men. This has to change the way that she sees people, the world, and everything. Oh, and also she starts bleeding, which is not a subject that I have any specialty in. These factors contribute very strongly when a teen girl divorces herself from childhood and starts to think of herself as a woman, or a young woman, or a teenager, or all of these things, but defining herself as a girl rather than a child. And even though a lot of people might not like this, what a woman is largely defined by their magical power to bear children. If they didn't have that magical power, then the men would have it, and the men would be the women. It's not as though you have to bear children if you're a woman. It's just that that's what is easily what makes a woman a woman. Because if they couldn't bear children, we'd die. As for men, we only have 6 categories, because men can't stop being fertile. We have the childhood age of prepubescent boys and then pubescent boys, the youth age, which is teenage boys and then young men, fatherhood, which is men who are often fathers, and then old men and grandpas. Now, you might notice that they're missing a step, and this is because men remain dangerously fertile up until they can't keep it up. And when a boy hits puberty, he doesn't experience the same dramatic biological shift that separates him from childhood as does a woman. I don't know why, honestly. I think it'd be cool if we started bleeding from our eyes or something. That has nothing to do with science, though. Actually, this might be the reason why so many different cultures have a ritual of manhood, but not a ritual of womanhood. Because women know immediately when they have become a woman, and men have to have it defined for them. And they have to transition on their own from teenage boy to young man, and then, if they want to, take the leap to fatherhood. And in order to do that, they have to have a woman. Because men can't be fathers on their own. That's impossible. Unless we can figure out how to build a robot. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't differences between men and women. There are, and they're pretty big. It's just that the differences in age are far more defining. If I had to rank it, I would say that people's interests are the most defining, followed by age, followed by sex, followed by maybe culture or height or some kind of, I don't know, it gets a little bit blurry when you start getting that far down. And obviously, this is just my opinion, but hey, the conclusion you can reach is that all these things, they don't divide us that much. We're all part of a shared human experience.